Forgotten graveyard. It started as a dare. Isn't that how it always starts? A bunch of us sitting around a bonfire in the woods, passing beers and telling ghost stories. I should have known better than to let Josh egg me on, but my pride always got the best of me. He knew it too. "You won't do it," Josh grinned, his face lit eerily by the firelight. "You're all talk, man." I glared at him. "I've done worse." "Then prove it. Go to the old graveyard. Spend the night there." The group went quiet. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to dull at the mention of the place. The forgotten graveyard. That's what everyone called it. Tucked away deep in the woods, no one really knew who was buried there or why it had been abandoned for so long. The place had a reputation. People said it was cursed, that anyone who stayed too long would never come back the same. "You're insane," I said, though I could already feel the challenge tugging at me. Josh just shrugged. "Unless you're scared." That was it. I was never one to back down from a dare, especially not from Josh. So with everyone watching, I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed into the woods, my heart pounding harder than I'd ever admit. It took nearly an hour to reach the graveyard. The trees thickened the further I went, the canopy blocking out what little moonlight remained. By the time I got there, my flashlight was the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. I had expected some kind of eerie mist or an ancient iron gate, but it was just a simple clearing surrounded by overgrown weeds. The gravestones were old, some tilted and half sunken into the earth, their engravings long worn away by time. There was no sign, no marker to say who was buried here. I stood there staring at the graves. It didn't feel haunted, just forgotten. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I let out a nervous laugh. I had psyched myself up for nothing. I found a relatively dry patch of grass and sat down, leaning against a moss-covered headstone. I'd spend the night, take a few selfies for proof, and be out of here by sunrise. Easy. Hours passed, and despite my nerves, I began to doze off. The cold earth beneath me was surprisingly comfortable, the weight of the dare slipping away as exhaustion took over. But then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The graveyard was still, the graves silent. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating the crooked tombstones, the twisted branches overhead. Nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. But the sound came again. Louder this time, closer. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was moving slowly, carefully, around the edge of the graveyard. My throat went dry as I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see Josh or one of the others trying to mess with me. "Josh?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "This isn't funny." No response, just more rustling. The beam of my flashlight flickered, the batteries weak. I smacked it a few times, cursing under my breath, but the light only grew dimmer. Then as I swung the beam toward the far end of the graveyard, I saw it. A figure, standing between two of the gravestones. It was barely visible in the dying light, but it was there. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes or maybe a robe. I couldn't tell. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned its head, its face hidden in shadow, and took a step toward me. Instinctively, I backed up, stumbling over a grave marker and nearly falling. "Who are you?" I yelled, my voice shaky. The figure said nothing, just stood there watching. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight flickering out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I turned, running toward the trees, but the second I moved, the footsteps followed. Faster, closer. I didn't dare look back. The forest was a maze in the dark, the branches clawing at my clothes, the roots catching at my feet. I ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear it. Those footsteps, relentless, always just behind me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed, gasping for breath. The footsteps had stopped. I was alone again, deep in the woods. My legs trembled as I tried to stand, the taste of copper in my mouth from running so hard. I glanced around trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. I was lost. The wind howled through the trees, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't hear the bonfire, couldn't see any lights from the town. The forest seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I had no idea how far I had run or in what direction. But then I saw something ahead, a clearing, and there in the center of it was the graveyard. I had never left. The same gravestones, the same overgrown weeds. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away. It wasn't possible. I had run for miles. How was I back here? And then I heard it again. The footsteps. I turned and there it was. The figure standing at the edge of the clearing, closer this time, its face still hidden in shadow. But now I could see something else. Its hands, long, pale fingers reaching out toward me, beckoning. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was those fingers, cold as death, wrapping around my wrist. 5, I woke up at dawn, lying on the cold ground next to a gravestone, my body trembling, my mind a blur. The graveyard was empty, silent. No sign of the figure, no footsteps, no whispers in the wind. But when I looked down, I saw something that will haunt me forever. There was dirt under my nails, as if I had been digging my own grave.